So without further ado, before we start talking about Satjayit Ray, when I look at the three films you chose, I'm thinking some commonalities. One of them was kind of interesting, is they're films for both young and old, in a sense. They're all three films are kind of multi-generational. Is that an interesting...
Well, I think it's a thing that the movies do at their best, is that they mean that the question, is this a children's film or a grown-up film, ceases to be a relevant question. That's not interesting, you know? Right. I mean, Who Framed Roger Rabbit? You know, is that a children's movie or a grown-up movie? I mean, I remember going to see it in an afternoon performance with my kids, and that I got so annoyed with the children in the audience because they were making so much noise that I couldn't hear the dialogue, that I went back again to see it in a late night performance so that I could see it without the goddamn children around, you know, and enjoyed it much more.
Yeah.
You know, and I think there's a lot of films like that, you know, where the question about the audience is no longer meaningful, you know, because they're just for everybody.
Yeah.
And people get different things from it. I mean, obviously, you know, a young person going to see Star Wars doesn't think about Kurosawa's Hidden Fortress, you know, but so what?
Well, if we can look past the audience, if I look at threads within the filmmakers, this is a strange thread, but advertising. Satjayit Ray worked in advertising.
Yeah.
Wes Anderson's father was in advertising, I believe.
Yeah.
And Wes's mother was an archaeologist, actually.
Yes.
So there is a kind of anthropological digging.
And I worked in advertising.
And, well, that's burying the lead, you know.
Yeah.
You not only worked in advertising, you had some interesting resume pieces, a commercial that John Cleese was in.
Yes.
Nick Rogue.
Nick Rogue and I made a Clairol Loving Care commercial.
Of course you did.
Yeah. We had some of the funniest lunches I can ever remember. Nicholas Rogue and I taking out gorgeous actresses in England of a certain age, all of whom we knew from Clairol were actual users of the product, and getting them to agree to say so on television.
Interesting.
And it required just colossal flattery, just epic industrial quantities of flattery were required. And Nick and I would often end the lunch having convinced the actress that she was so unbearably beautiful that who would care that she had a couple of white hairs which she covered up with Clairol Loving Care, because she was like the most extraordinary creature on earth. And she would say, okay, all right. And then she'd go home and talk to her agent and her husband and call up and say, you know, maybe not. And so we had great difficulty finding someone to do it, but we did in the end.
It's interesting.
But you see, that moment in England in the 70s when I was part-timing in advertising was also a moment when a lot of people who became this extraordinary generation of British filmmakers were all doing the same thing. They were all moonlighting in advertising. So
it was Ridley
Scott, Tony Scott, Hugh Hudson, Alan Parker, Nicholas Rogue, you know, to name just five.
Incredible.
Were all making beef burger commercials, you know, while they set up their movies.
And I also was thinking about Hitchcock, who had done title design for Paramount. I mean, there's something about the graphic elements, study of graphic elements that seem to be...
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, it's just, it was a way of getting paid while you were trying to work out the real thing you wanted to do, but you were still using your skills, you know, and I think all these filmmakers, I mean, it's a kind of film festival waiting to be created, is the advertising commercials made by great filmmakers.
I agree.
You know, and would be really interesting, I think. You know?
Speaking of interesting, let's talk about your first choice, a film that you quite candidly put above Citizen Kane, which is Panchali, 1955.
You want to see the clip first?
Or
talk about it
tell us
first.
before.
I have that.
We'll do this in pieces.
Oh, right.
Tell us why you chose it, then we'll watch the scene, then we'll get into it a little bit.
Well, I mean, I do think if I was really asked to put my hand on my heart and choose one film as the best film ever made, I would choose this film.
The best film ever made.
Ever made, yes. I mean, you know, that's a sort of stupid category, in a way.
We all know it, though.
Because there's no such thing as the best film ever made.
Right.
But if I had to pick a film for that non-existent category, it would be this film. And it's, well, first of all the three films of the Apu trilogy are masterpieces. But this is the first one. And it's the first film he made. it's about rather beautifully about childhood, and everybody, almost all the actors were amateurs except for the old lady, who was a well-known theatre actress.
Yes.
that he got out of retirement to be in the film. And the film was made by somebody who'd never directed a film. Subroto Mithra, who was the DP, had never shot a film.
He was a still photographer.
Yeah, it never shot a film. Yeah. And yet they had no money. The film was shot over a period of more than 2 years because they kept running out of money.
Yeah.
And they had to stop making the film until they could get a bit more money together.
His wife had to sell her jewels.
Yeah,
at some point.
and they were worried that the old lady would die. The old lady was very, very old.
He paid her in medication, actually.
Yeah.
And she never saw, pardon me for
Never saw
she
it.
never saw the complete.
Never saw it. Panchali means the song of the little road, and it's a film about this small village in which this little boy Apu, which if you pronounce him correctly in Bengali is Opu, in the way that Satjayit Ray is actually Satjayit Ray, but never mind. Anyway, Apu and his sister Durga are growing up in this little village in a very poor family, and she's the complicated older sister. There's a crucial moment in the scene where she's accused of the film where she's accused of stealing something, and it's just a portrait of village life which is incredibly emotional and powerful, and it came from a great Bengali novel. And
Have you read the novel?
No, I read it since. I hadn't read it when I first saw the film. But the interesting thing about the novel is that the view of village life in the novel is much less sweet.
Yes.
It's much harsher. Like in the novel, there are at least 2, actually maybe 3 acts of sexual violence, which for none of which the men are held responsible. And life in the village is much tougher and harsher in the book. In the film, there is a little romantic element that has crept into the film, I have to say. Life in the village is quite tough, but it's also quite sweet.
Yes.
And is enormously lifted by Ravi Shankar's music.
Just on an aside, the other great thinkers, present company included, who have spoken so eloquently about this film. Arthur C. Clarke loved this film.
Is that right?
Sal Bellow. There's a character in one of Bellow's novels. The protagonist is watching this film. Matt Groening of The Simpsons, Apu. The character of Apu is
named after him. Yes, yeah. Oh, that's interesting.
Not to mention another one of our friends here, Wes Anderson. He called the Darjeeling Limited a cross between Pather Panchali and Husbands, Cassavetes' film.
Oh, yeah.
And there's this scene in Darjeeling Limited, which to him was an homage
To Ray.
of it. Yeah. But it's interesting, isn't it interesting that kind of hereditary line of those? What is it about, aside from the analytical, what is it about on an emotional level, this film?
Well, I mean, it's in a way not unlike what I said about The Wizard of Oz. It's about childhood, about growing up, and it's in a very poor village, and it's about love. It's about family love. Love inside a family, and sometimes the failures of that love, and it is still about cruelty of village life. I mean, there's a thing in the film where their next door neighbors are a bit better off than they are and have fruit trees,
right.
And the daughter sometimes steals a fruit, and is abused for it.
Yeah.
And you can see that. I mean, the fruit falls off the tree anyway and is lying there in the street, so it, in a sense, doesn't belong to anybody.
As the mother says, it doesn't have a name on it.
Doesn't have a name on it. So what is remarkable, I think, about it, apart from everything else, is the way in which the music replaces dialogue.
Yes.
So that the emotion of the scene, in fact, the narrative of the scene is conveyed through what happens in the music. When the music first comes in, you begin to see it's the mother's grief, and then as the music soars, it becomes the father's discovery of his daughter's death. And it's all done entirely without language. But that's Ravi Shankar.
who is in a way, scoring a film on that level is characterization. When you can get into that part of the film, he's almost in the film, Shankar.
And I mean, Ray was one of these polymathic filmmakers of the kind of Orson Welles kind that he could do everything.
Yes.
And in later films, he did write the music himself.
Amazing.
But in this first film, he asked Ravi Shankar to help him.
Yes.
And that's the result.
Quite a coup.
Yeah.
A former student, a little aside, a former student of the Modern School of Film wanted to ask you a question, and he couldn't be with us tonight. He's one of our kind of prized students. We've been able to access his question for you electronically. Is that okay?
Okay, yes.
Hello, I'm Wes Anderson. I'm the director of one of the films that Salman has picked to show, and it's not Star Wars. And I thought I would ask a question for the Q&A. Salman, I'm wondering if you have ever met Satjayit Ray, or if you ever met him. If you didn't ever meet him, then there won't be much to say about that. So I'll ask a different question. Do you remember where you first saw Star Wars? What cinema? Maybe you can tell us your experience.
Very generous for him to take.
Very sweet. I met Ray late in his life. I was on a book tour. I was in Calcutta, and I met somebody who was a relative of his, and said, would I like to? He was shooting on location in the countryside, and the film that eventually became The Home in the World. Gore Baire. She said, would I like to go and visit him on location? So
amazing.
I said,
Exactly.
Is the Pope Catholic? I thought, yes, I said. So we went off, and it was really, he was shooting in the very deep cut. You go up the trunk roads, and then when you turn off the trunk road, the modern world disappears. You're suddenly on dirt tracks, and you're in huge open countryside, some of which has never actually been properly mapped. There are little villages dotted around, and down like 3 hours. I mean, you're driving very slowly because you're on a very rough road, but 3 hours drive down this road, there was this the house of one of the old zamindars, landlords, who had obviously sort of feudal landlord who had owned this area, and that's where he was shooting The Home in the World. And then he was staying at a local sort of government-run inn, where we all stayed, and so I had this amazing good fortune of spending 2 or 3 days, literally seeing him from breakfast in the morning until bedtime, and the two things that I remember most vividly are, first of all, that it so happened that Ray made 2 or 3 wonderful children's films, because he saw his father started a children's magazine called Shandesh, which means kind of a sweetmeat, and Ray used to contribute to it, and when his father died, he took over the editorship of it and went on editing it throughout his lifetime, and invented various characters. In fact, there's the character of a detective, Feluda, who occurs a lot in those children's things, and he made a couple of films starring this detective. And the most beautiful of which, I think, is a film called The Golden Fortress. And it's one of Ray's films that never really got wide distribution in the West, and probably because it was a children's film.
This is a film you chose to curate at Telluride, actually.
I did, yeah.
You did a mini triptych of films, which was Solaris and this.
Yeah, I mean, I was a guest director. They have this guest curator thing at Telluride, and that was one of the films I chose. And it was a smash hit, and they had to put on extra performances of it all the time. And I thought how wonderful that Ray would have loved. This was his ignored child, Because I remember when I said to him at breakfast, I said, your film, The Golden Fortress, Shonar Kela, I said, I really love that film. And it's like he jumped erupted from his chair. He was huge, he was 6'4" or something.
Yeah. He seems quite tall, as you even.
Yeah, he's a very big man.
Yes.
And he jumped to his feet and shouted. He said, that film! He said, you like that film? Nobody has seen that film. And I said, well, I saw it, and so that was what broke the ice between him and me, that I liked his ignored child.
Yes.
And then the other thing that was remarkable was watching him direct a scene. We would go to the location, and there were all these great actors, because Ray had, in a way, like Bergman, had a kind of company of actors that he would use over and over again. Soumitra Chatterjee, various others. In fact, in The Golden Fortress, Soumitra Chatterjee plays the detective Feluda. But anyway, there's a scene where all the actors sort of stand there with their scripts, and Ray has his script, and he says to them, he says, "Oh, you stand here, you stand there, you stand there, you stand there," and then he would literally jump from position to position and act out all the parts.
Amazing.
And then he would finish doing it, and he would turn to them and he would say, "Do it like that."
Amazing.
And because it was Ray, they said, "Okay."
Yeah.
They did it like that. So I've never known anyone else do that quite.
I'll dovetail. Cassavetes would do that on a different level. Cassavetes would never type his scripts or write them. He would actually act them, and whether his support team would transcribe them. But it is interesting.
But Ray would I actually was fortunate enough once to, after he passed away, in Calcutta to go to visit his family, and they showed me in the archive that he was incredibly meticulous. I mean, he would have these exercise books.
Can we show that slide? There's a slide
like that, which would really be like storyboard sketches.
Yeah.
And on the right-hand page there would be dialogue. So he would every film of his, there would be these workbooks with very carefully blocked out. Kind of almost like the way that Eisenstein would compose a scene. Where the actual physical shape of the scene was pre-created, and then on the right-hand side there would be, so he was he wasn't nearly as given to improvisation as, say, Cassavetes.
Yes.
But very worked out. But then this is how he would direct. He would totally direct. He would say, "Do it like this." He would do the female parts, the male parts, the children's parts, the old woman's part. And everybody would say, "Oh, okay, we'll do that then."
Well, it's interesting. He once said that screenwriting is a useless exercise because the words become meaningless. And I was thinking about that in the sense of the document of a screenplay. If we could digress, what for you makes a good screenplay? I mean, drawing images is a form of screenwriting.
Yeah. Well, I remember talking to Nick Rogue many years later, not when we were making the commercial, but when he had made several of his films. And he said, I mean, I don't want to misquote him, but he basically expressed a relative lack of interest in the dramatic form of the screenplay. He said, in a movie, if people come out with 6 pictures in their head that they'll never forget, that's a good movie.
I love that.
And I remember, I talked to Cronenberg once about his idea of making a film, and he said, "You have to see the camera." He said, "The camera is like a little cube of space." And he said, that little cube moves through the world, and what it sees is the film. So you have to just imagine that cube moving. Wow. And that makes the film.
I love that.
That's rather beautiful.
I'm convinced he uses a cube.
Yes, yeah.
Interesting, another thing about the dramaturgy here, the experience of the film was not Ray's human experience.
No.
Because that was not his upbringing.
No, he was much better off.
Much more urbane.
Yeah, much better off than that.
It led me also to another question for you. We tell students often, write what you know, film what you know. Where do you come down on that?
Well, I have this thing. What I say is, write what you know if what you know is interesting.
Curtain. Yes, right.